So I will briefly introduce the speaker and the topic. You all know Dr. Mihir Shah's excellent work on water and development. He has written several research papers and books on this topic and also submitted several reports to Government of India. So he is presently the distinguished professor at Srinagar University, where he has designed master's program water science, water science and policy. As you know, from 2009 to 2014, he was member planning commission and was chiefly responsible for drafting the paradigm shift in the management of water resources discussed in the 12th five-year plan. In 2016, Mihir Shah committee submitted a report called a 21st century institutional architecture for India's water reforms. And also 2 years back in 2019, he chaired a committee to draft a new water policy for India. And he also helped some state governments on water policy. Apart from research and policy work, he's also known for working at the grassroots level. He was telling, he was in his village. In 1990, he co-founded Samaj Pragati Sahyog, which is today one of the largest grassroots initiative for water and livelihood security, working with its partners on 1 million acres of land across several most India's backward districts. Dr. Shah has spent nearly 3 decades living and working in central, tribal India and forging a new paradigm of inclusive and sustainable development. So you can't have a better person than Dr. Mihir Shah to speak on the topic. I thank him for accepting our invitation. Now, turning to the topic of today, as Dr. Shah's reports and research papers suggest, the need for a paradigm shift in agriculture to solve water problems and also the need for paradigm shift in water management and governance. As you know, India had green revolution and became self-sufficient in food grains, but it was only wheat and rice revolution, not for other crops. So it led to waterlogging, soil erosion, and groundwater depletion, leading to unsustainability of agriculture. In fact, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan appealed to the farmers as early as 1968 not to harm the long-term production potential for short-term gains. So he pleaded the farmers not to convert the green revolution into greed revolution. So other crops were not given enough incentives. The minimum support prices and procurement policies were also partly responsible for this bias. In fact, when I was chairman of CSCP in the Ministry of Agriculture, I tried to give more MSPs to pulses and oil seeds. In fact, in 2009, we increased 40% of MSP to pulses. Although there was no procurement for pulses, the pulses production increased from 14 million tons to 18 million tons. So, of course, if procurement is there, it would have increased much more. So, there is a need for giving to other crops other than rice and wheat. In general, we have two agricultures. One is cereal based, particularly rice and wheat, and the other non-rice and wheat agriculture. So government policies like price and water policies tend to focus on rice and wheat. In fact, as many studies show, 3 crops, rice, wheat, sugarcane, cover 70 to 80% of irrigated water in the country. Rice and wheat cultivation in Punjab, Haryana also is not sustainable because of groundwater depletion. And there is a need to promote millets, pulses, oil seeds, horticulture, etc., for more equal distribution of water. So this paradigm shift in agriculture can help in solving water problems. So shifting cropping patterns also has other benefits. For example, increase in nutrition due to improvements in proteins and micronutrients. Second one is that it is good for environment point of view. Third one is to tackle climate change. The cropping pattern shift is needed. For example, promotion of pulses can lead to climate resilient cropping pattern. as less water is needed and soil quality can also be increased. So another issue is water management and governance. Here, efficiency of investments in irrigation and institutions are important. A Niti Aayog study says that India uses 2-3 times the water used to produce 1 ton of grain in countries like China, Brazil, and USA. So that implies that with water use efficiency of those countries, India can at least double irrigation coverage or save 50% water currently used in irrigation. The saved water can be used for drinking water and other purposes. So it is clear that better and efficient management of water resources is necessary for India to achieve more crops per drop. As you know, conflicts over water are a grim reality today. Interstate disputes and conflicts of water at farm level are expected to increase over time. The problem is not due to shortage of water resource, but due to the absence of proper mechanisms for its augmentation, conservation, distribution, and efficient use. So we need institutions for better water management, which should be given #1 priority regarding policies on agriculture. So conservation of surface and groundwater has become imperative. Water use efficiency can be increased significantly in agriculture, but multiple approaches are needed for this purpose. One is, for example, MGNREGA created assets would be useful for drought proofing, and drip irrigation is one of the important mechanisms to improve water efficiency. So use of technologies for water and also technologies for seeds can save water. For groundwater management, we need to remove free electricity policies and reduce water intensive crops. Farmer producer organizations reforming institutional structure in favor of participation irrigation management, and water user associations, watershed committees, self-help groups would help in water management. Lastly, shifting to conservation agriculture and natural farming also help in saving water. So with these words, I request Dr. Mihir Shah to deliver his lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mahendra Dev. I also thank my friend Professor Srijit Mishra for inviting me to give this lecture. So I request Tanmay to please share the screen.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, Tanmay can now share the screen, and I'll ask Professor Shah also switch off your video because you have low internet connection, so it will be better. Your audio will come better. Then once this question session will start, then we can switch on your video. Yeah, then I start slides.
Right. Everyone can see the screen, I hope.
Yes, sir. We are able to see.
Yeah. So, as Professor Mahendra Dev was just mentioning, we actually wrote this paper for the FAO and the Niti Aayog, and recently the paper has been published in 2 parts in the Economic and Political Weekly. So I'm sure some of you have already read the paper, and you'll have to wait for me to tell you. Okay, please
Yes,
wait
sir.
for me. I'll tell you when to go to the next slide. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes. What we are arguing is, that there is a crisis in agriculture and in water in India.
There are 10 students candidate जिन्होंने acceptance पे किया है, and they have to 1 or 2 days for making payment of first year's fee. तो वो 2 दिन में कर देंगे. अच्छा. एक का थोड़ा payment का problem था.
Somebody has to
please mute yourself. Sambhu, will you please mute yourself?
तो ऐसे कितना में allow करते हैं.
Sambhu, can you please mute yourself?
Lingara, can you just mute it?
25 लोग ऐसे थे जिनके लिए
Lingara, you have to also.
Okay. Tanmay, you go to your PowerPoint slide. I'll take care of this mute on put. Okay.
Okay.
up your slide.
But Lingiraj, I think Lingiraj, you have to be on mute also. You have a lot of disturbance in the back. Everybody should be on mute. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, please. Next. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. So, the major argument of the paper is that you cannot look at the crisis in water and this in agriculture separated from each other. We have to see that there is an interconnection in these two crises, and that is what the major argument of our paper is. Now, there is no doubt that India has been facing a major crisis in agriculture. As you all know, in the last 30 years, 300,000 farmers have committed suicide. And that is something that is completely unprecedented in Indian history. You know, you've had farm crises, you've had hunger, but you haven't had a phenomenon of so many farmers committing suicide because of an agrarian crisis. So somewhere it is something we need to address. And I'm just briefly going to talk about the various dimensions of this crisis. So on this slide, you can see the fact that there are falling water tables and water quality. So in about 60% of India's districts, you either find falling water tables or very serious water quality issues. We also have a lot of studies which show that more and more chemical inputs are being required now in order to attain the same level of output. There's a study which shows that, and this is all summarized in our paper, that the average crop response to fertilizer use has fallen to about a quarter of what it was in the 1960s. And we also are aware now, and the paper documents in great detail, the problems that excessive pesticide use has created for not only farm incomes, but for health of both farm workers and consumers, and has impacted the natural cycles essential in agricultural production in multiple ways. It's also true that because the prices of chemical inputs are rising exponentially and the application of these inputs is becoming more and more essential, the net farm income is actually turning negative in many cases. Next slide, Tanmay. We also know that there is a major crisis of health now. Despite the kind of buffer stocks of grain that have become possible due to the Green Revolution, the IFPRI's 2020 Global Hunger Index report shows that India is now ranked 94th out of 107 countries. 189 million people remained malnourished in India during 2017-19, which is more than a quarter of the total such people in the world. But it's also true that while there is so much malnourishment, diabetes is now become a kind of national epidemic, and the number of diabetics have increased in every Indian state, even among the poor, in the last 30 years or so. The number has reached 65 million in 2016 and is projected to double by 2030. Next slide. So we are arguing for, next slide, Tanmay.
Yes, sir.
We are arguing for a paradigm shift in farming. And here I'll tell you all the different dimensions in which we are speaking of. No, please go back. No, you've gone ahead. See, the fact is that just 3 highly water intensive crops, rice, wheat, and sugarcane, today take up as much as 80% of India's irrigated water. And they are being grown even in areas which are water scarce. And I'll just explain why that is still going on. While India's agroecology is eminently suited to growing a much higher share of nutri cereals, pulses, and oil seeds, all of which also consume much lower volumes of water. By raising their share in the cropping pattern, we will be able to meet the domestic water needs of millions of our people and also the irrigation requirements of so many of our small and marginal farmers who are currently being deprived of water because of this skewed distribution of irrigation water across crops and farmers in this country and across the regions of this country. Next slide. So what we have done in this paper is to study 11 major states of the country, which together account for 2/3 of India's irrigated area. The states are there on the slide in front of you, so I'm not going to repeat their names. And what we did was a major statistical exercise, a projection, a scenario building exercise, where we said that if we built two scenarios. In one scenario, we said we can shift the 10 to 25% of the crops in the Kharif season to nutri-cereals, pulses, and oilseeds by 2030, and 25% in the Rabi season. And in the second scenario, we spoke about 25 to 50% shift in the Kharif season and a 50% shift in the Rabi season. Next slide. And what we found through very detailed calculations is that we could reduce as much as 18 to 36% of our irrigation water use by doing so. And this, if you go through the paper, you will find detailed calculations for each state. And if anyone of you is interested, we can share even the detailed Excel sheets, etc., so that you can, actually replicate this kind of calculation in whichever level of disaggregation you would like to do that. Now, it's all very well to say that this should happen. And many people have been arguing this for a long time. But we do need a particular policy lever which will incentivize this change to happen. And that's why we are saying, how do we create the demand? And what we are saying, therefore, is that we need to diversify the portfolio of public procurement to align with regional agroecologies. And to do that, we must introduce these crops into the midday meals and the ICDS and the public distribution system. If we do that, we create a humongous demand for these crops, which today we are in fact not going to be able to be in a position to meet. But as the demand for these crops grows, the farmers in India who have in a way been almost compelled to grow rice and wheat because that's all, overwhelmingly, that is all that the government has been procuring from the farmers. We are suggesting that in alignment with regional agroecology, if you shift the procurement basket to include nutri-cereals, pulses, and oilseeds, and then use these, feed the midday meals, ICDS, and PDS, you will actually create the right kind of structure of incentives for India's farmers. Now, a lot of people are worried that, are you asking for an open-ended procurement? And what we are saying is, look, there is already something which the PM Asha scheme has proposed. And this scheme, of course, it's not yet, but it is clearly stating that we must procure 25% of the production of that crop in each season. And if that crop is part of the PDS, then it can be expanded to 40%. What we are saying is, if you can diversify even to this extent, it will have a great knock-on effect on the market as a whole, and there will be a huge incentive for farmers to diversify their cropping pattern. So even with a shift to 25% of procurement, and we are not saying, therefore, that we stop procuring wheat and rice or that we stop growing wheat and rice. What we are saying is we diversify both public procurement and the cropping patterns, and you get a greater balance in the crops that are grown and those are procured and those which are eaten, especially by our children. Next slide. Now, often a question is also raised when we make this proposal that will endanger food security in India and that farmer incomes could be adversely impacted. So we have a counter to this argument, which is a multi-stage counter. See, the first point we are making The first point we are making is that given the deteriorating groundwater situation in Punjab and Haryana, it is going to be impossible to sustain the productivity levels required to produce wheat and rice at the levels at which they are being produced currently and therefore being used in the buffer stocks. So to say that we should maintain status quo is not a feasible option at all. What we are also saying is we are arguing that rice must be grown, but it must be grown in regions which are agroecologically more suitable for the cultivation of rice, which means you shift to eastern India. Today, what's happening in the east? It's such a crazy situation we have where a region which is completely suited for cultivation of rice is having to depend on groundwater short areas for their food grains. Food is actually traveling from the north and the west to the east, which is something which makes no sense either ecologically or in terms of the economic logic. We are also saying that for over a decade at least now, the buffer stock norms for rice and wheat, I think somebody. Lingaraj, you should mute everybody.
ત્રીજો નંબર છે એમાં મિહિર લખ્યું છે મિહિર. અરે શ્રીજીત મિશ્રાનો છે અરે તમે બ્લુ લાઈટ જો મારામાં તો ખુલી ગયો છે જો.
અરે તમે મ્યુટ કરો ભાઈ.
પહેલી બ્લુ લાઈટ पहली ब्लू लाइन क्लिक करो.
Lingaraj, you can't mute them.
Lingaraj, please mute Dinesh Awasthi.
सर वो
Okay.
मेरा तो स्क्रीन पूरा ही है, कैसे करूँ? म्यूट करने का है ना? आज
Okay, I think if everyone can just keep quiet. Dinesh Awasthi, you need to make sure mute. Okay, I'll continue now. So I was saying that the rice and wheat stocks are already well over the buffer norm, and in any case, we cannot afford to continue, as Professor Mahendra Dev was alluding earlier to the context of climate change. We cannot afford to continue with the monocultures of the Green Revolution. In our paper, we have summarized extensive evidence from all over the world how monoculture is a complete disaster for agriculture. Agriculture has to take place in the context of diversity, and not doing that actually endangers yields. It makes farmers much more vulnerable to climate change. And finally, as I said earlier, the excessive use of increasingly expensive chemical inputs has become a major strain on farmer incomes. So the proposals we are making in our paper will actually protect farmer incomes and ensure greater national food security. Next slide. I also, of course, want to bring to your attention that food security, as we have understood in our country so far, is very different from nutritional security. And the proposal that we are making, Tanmay, have you gone to the next slide?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, the proposals we are making, the replacement crops that we are proposing have a much lower glycemic index while providing higher content of dietary fiber, vitamins, minerals, proteins, and antioxidants. The productivity of nutri-cereals has also risen in recent years, because of which, despite a reduction in acreage, their production has not declined. Of course, what we need is greater R&D investments in nutri-cereals so that their productivity can be further improved. And it is a welcome sign that the recent increases in MSP, what Professor Mahendra Dev was alluding to earlier, I think it started when he was chair of the CACP. The MSP rises of our replacement crops have been more than that of rice and wheat, and this needs to be taken even further to create a greater incentive for farmers to grow crops which are nutritionally far superior for the consumers in our country. Next, Tanmay, next slide, please.
Yes, sir.
Now, the other element of the paradigm shift that we are talking about is our whole vision of agricultural production and how we look at the soil. In the Green Revolution vision, the soil was a stockpile of minerals and salts. And as per Liebig's law of the minimum, crop production was basically constrained by the nutrient least present in the soil, which is what led to this entire NPK emphasis under the Green Revolution. So the soil was to be enriched with chemical fertilizers, and the soil was just a base with physical attributes necessary to hold the roots of the crops. Crops and soil were brute physical matter, collections of molecules to be optimized by chemical recipes, rather than what they actually are, flowing energy charged wholes. Next slide, please, Tanmay.
Yes, sir.
So what we are proposing is that the soil is and must be regarded as a living entity, and the activity and species diversity of soil biota are responsible for innumerable essential ecosystem services, which we have not taken seriously enough. And you know, Professor Ratan Lal, one of the most eminent scientists we have, agriculture scientists, soil scientists in the world, he has been studying the soil organic matter in the soils in India and in Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, Delhi, Central and South India. We hardly have 0.2 to 0.5% soil organic matter, while it should be at least 2.5 to 3% in the root zone by weight. And you know, there is a very important relationship between soil quality and water productivity. As Professor Mahendra Dev was emphasizing in the beginning, our water productivity levels are very low. And higher soil organic matter improves the water infiltration rate and the soil's available water holding capacity. It's a much larger subject which is discussed in great detail in our paper. I would urge all of you to go and study that. Next slide. So putting all of these elements of the paradigm shift together, what we are arguing for is what the FAO in its recent quinquennial review, the FAO is reviewing its
Go to the next.
Where the FAO is reviewing its entire strategy on agriculture. And this is what the FAO has to say, which is arguing strongly in favor of moving in the direction of agroecology. Because high input, resource intensive farming systems, which have caused massive deforestation, water scarcity, soil depletion, and high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, cannot deliver sustainable agriculture. Needed are innovative systems that protect and enhance the natural resource base while increasing productivity. Needed is a transformative process towards holistic approaches such as agroecology and conservation agriculture, which also build upon indigenous and traditional knowledge. So I want to make it very clear, you know, we are not arguing in favor of any kind of fundamentalism. We are as much against the fundamentalism of natural farming, if somebody were to go in that direction, as we are against the fundamentalism of the Green Revolution. We are saying, let us combine modern science with traditional and indigenous knowledge and arrive at an agroecological system which actually rejuvenates the natural base for agriculture. Next slide. Tanmay?
Yes, sir.
So what we are arguing for is shifting the emphasis away from factor productivity. You know, the preoccupation of economists always is with factor productivity. And now the new concept that we are presenting to the world, which is now, you know, taking over everywhere, is total system productivity. We need to look at it as a system as a whole. The food system with a high TSP will be sufficient productive to be while imposing very few costs on the environment and society. Maximizing TSP would maximize the number of people fed healthily and sustainably per unit input, and this would therefore increase overall systemic efficiency. Next slide. So this is in brief my description of the paradigm shift needed in agriculture. Now I will briefly speak about the paradigm shift required in water. Tanmay, next slide. So there are different elements to the paradigm shift that is needed in water. Let's begin with the oldest element of water policy in this country. No, please go back to the previous slide. Then my PIM in irrigation commands. That's a slide I want.
Yes, sir.
So,
PM irrigation command.
We have been building, yes, we have been building large dams since independence. And I am for a moment asking you to leave aside the debate on large dams. You know, there's a whole argument against large dams. There are others who are for large dams. I'm saying, let's leave that debate aside. Let's look at the facts on the ground. What do the facts tell us? We do not anymore have many new sites left for construction of large dam structures. Most of our rivers are reaching what is called basin closure. So it's almost now academic, the question of whether we should build more large dams or not, whether they are good or bad. The fact is that option is basically we have run out of time for that option. But the good news, or if you like, it can be seen as bad news in the first place. And it's also good news because it holds a great potential. Trillions of liters of water are lying in the reservoirs of these large dams, but they are not reaching the farmers for whom this water was meant. So the way forward is participatory irrigation management. Many states in this country and many countries across the world have successfully experimented and moved forward in the direction of PI. But of course, this will happen if and only if, you know, the word you see on the screen is IFF. It's not a typo. It's shorthand for, as many of you know, if and only if. So if and only if water users associations of farmers are adequately empowered to take charge of their commands. Once irrigation commands are properly debureaucratized, where the irrigation departments do not have a stranglehold on these command areas, but there is genuine people's participation, and the water users associations of farmers are allowed to retain irrigation services. They are allowed to retain the irrigation service fees so that they can meet the operation and maintenance costs of these systems. These are fairly complicated systems, but our experience on the ground has shown, and many organizations, many state governments
charging
have somebody is constantly speaking in the Amita Ben, your mic has been muted. Amita Ben, Amita Shah.
Yeah, yes, hello. Yeah.
Please mute your mic, Amita. Please mute your mic.
I'm sorry, I'll do that.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm saying is that, once farmers are given this kind of power, the water user associations are able to actually deliver water to the last mile, so that every farm, including the people who are on the tail end of the command, are able to gain access to irrigation water. And the Niti Aayog actually has made an estimate which shows that there is a huge gap between our irrigation potential created, the IPC mentioned on the slide, and the irrigation potential utilized. This gap between IPC and IPU must be bridged. If we can bridge it, and we can bridge it at very low cost, we can add as much as 24 million hectares to India's irrigated area at half the per hectare cost of building new large dams. Next, Tanmay.
Yes.
So this was my brief exposition on what must happen with the surface water reform. Now we come to the most important source of water in India, that is groundwater. India is today the largest consumer of groundwater in the world. 2/3 of our irrigation comes from groundwater. 80 to 90% of our water is now coming from groundwater. And that is, groundwater is what drove India's green revolution. But today, we are in a situation of what is in philosophy called a vicious infinite regress. That is, the solution to the problem is becoming part of the problem itself. And the reason for that is very simple. See, if you want to manage a resource, then you need to That's the nature of that. And the fact is that in India, water policy has not sufficiently adequately recognized the common pool resource nature of groundwater. Once a resource is necessarily shared by people, it has to be managed in a collective way. You cannot manage groundwater the way we are doing today, where individuals are extracting groundwater as much as they please. If you see the last bullet on this slide, we are still governed by 19th century British common law. Now, 19th century British common law gives indefinite who owns land. So all the water below my land, that has led to serious competition and depletion of groundwater aquifers in this country, especially bearing in mind there is somebody who needs to unmute their mic. I think
Yes, sir.
Lingaraj, your mic
Lingaraj,
needs to
can
be
you
muted.
mute?
Yeah. So we have 2/3 of our aquifers in India are hard rock aquifers. Now, hard rock aquifers are those where the rate of groundwater recharge is very low. So once you extract water from below the ground in these hard rock aquifers, which occupy, as I said, 2/3 of India's land mass, it takes a very long time for the recharged again. And this is what has caused the groundwater crisis in India today. Because we have indiscriminately extended our policy of extracting groundwater through deep bore wells or tube wells throughout the length and breadth of India. It was okay while it was being done in the alluvial aquifers, which are only 1/3 of the country. But once they've been extended to the hard rock aquifers, they have actually led to a mining of groundwater. Water which took thousands of years to accumulate below the ground has been extracted within the last 30 years. So what is the way forward? What we are saying is we again need to adopt a participatory approach to groundwater management, what is called PGWM, because being a common pool resource, be possibly, policing 45 million groundwater structures. At last count, the groundwater structures in India were as many. The wells and tube wells are 45 million. You cannot unleash an army of policemen on the farmers and other users of groundwater in this country. Basically, where it has worked is where we have incentivized the farmers to come together. We have made them aware of the nature of the aquifers that lie below their ground, and they have come together as collectives to manage this groundwater together. We also need to break the groundwater energy nexus. Professor Mahendra Dev, alluded to the free availability of electricity. Now, I'm not going as far as to say that therefore you should do marginal cost pricing of power. I think that would make farming unviable for millions of small and marginal farmers. But there have been attempts at trying to find a middle path through separation of power feeders. That has happened in some states of the country, and it has produced some good results, where you have 8 hours of good quality ration power for farmers and 24 hours power for the village, the schools and the hospitals, etc. That seems to have allowed a more effective management of groundwater. This is an issue which still needs further work on. The jury is still out on this one, but certainly we have to address the groundwater energy nexus. And of course, we have to reform 19th century British common law. I was asked to chair a committee. We have produced actually an alternative groundwater management bill, which would bring to the 4 more participatory approaches to groundwater management, building on the public trust doctrine enunciated by the Supreme Court in various judgments that it has passed on issues concerning common pool resources. Next slide, Tanmay. Other than surface water and groundwater, and related very deeply to both of them, is the state of our river basins, our rivers. Recent studies have shown that there has been a decline in the annual runoff generated by India's major river basins. And this is not, mind you, because of a decline in rainfall. It has happened because of economic activities destructive of the catchment areas of these rivers. And the fear is that if this trend continues, most of our rivers are going to completely dry up. Now, the good news here is that all over the world, payments for ecosystem services for the stewards of our catchment areas have actually provided a great fillip for the protection of our catchment areas and have actually resulted in keeping our river basins healthy and green. And river flows have been restored in many rivers across the world. And I think India should not lose any time. And recently I was in a discussion with Mr. Rajiv Kumar, the vice chair of the Niti Aayog, and he was very excited about the idea, and he's looking for suggestions. And I would urge all the eminent economists listening to my talk that let's get together and find ways of operationalizing payments for ecosystem services for those who are actually protecting the lifelines of this country, which are our rivers. And I'm suggesting that the MGNREGA could also be a very powerful instrument in this direction as a policy lever. Next slide, then. And finally, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that water reform, the paradigm shift in water, will not happen till we reform the governance of water in this country. I have been now speaking about this for some years now and trying to urge policy to move in this direction, that in India, water management and governance suffers from a deep hydroschizophrenia. So we have divided water into silos, and this is a threefold hydroschizophrenia. There is a division between surface and groundwater. The agencies managing surface are different, the agencies managing groundwater are different, and they rarely, if ever, even talk to each other. The agencies handling drinking water and irrigation are different. I think they will need to remain different, but they need to work very closely in tandem with each other, as also the management of water and wastewater must go together. Very briefly, I'll give you some examples of what happens when we continue as we are doing with this hydroschizophrenia. You know, I mentioned just now about the rivers drying up. The single most important reason for India's rivers drying up is the over-extraction of groundwater in their catchment areas. Because what we forget is that the peninsular rivers in our country are actually sustained after the monsoon is over by the base flows of groundwater. Once you over-extract groundwater, what happens is water will always find its own level, and the water in the aquifers has gone down to such a low level that water from the rivers starts flowing towards the ground. So rivers, instead of being gaining rivers, actually become losing rivers. So what happens, what has happened in fact, more and more, is that our aquifers have also dried up and our rivers are also drying up. And this is a classic example of the danger of hydroschizophrenia, of not working on surface and groundwater together. If you look at drinking water and irrigation, the simplest example I always give is that, you know, the drinking water missions have been going on for the last 40 years now, since the Rajiv Gandhi drinking water mission of the 1980s. And, you know, if you read the reports of the departments of drinking water in every state and even nationally, you will find that the coverage of locations of settlements by safe drinking water has been growing steadily over the years. But if you look at the tables more carefully, if you are looking at one of these government reports and you go a few pages down that report, you will find another set of tables of what are called slipped back habitations. What is a slipped back habitation? That is a habitation which was dependent on groundwater for its drinking water, but the cultivation of water intensive crops using water from the same aquifer, we drew away water from that aquifer towards these water intensive crops. And as you know, irrigation draws an incomparably larger amount of water compared to drinking water. So what has happened is the drinking water source has dried up. And this has happened in location after location. So because we do not look at drinking water and irrigation in a holistic manner and plan for them together, what happens is you keep setting up drinking water sources and they keep drying up year after year. And the hydroschizophrenia between water and wastewater, essentially, as you all know, leads to a decline in water quality, Because when we set up, say, sanitation systems, we do not actually take care of the drainage of the wastewater. And I'm afraid this is what's happening all over the country. We have given a great impetus to sanitation, but we have not seen very carefully whether the drinking water sources are not being negatively impacted as a result. So overcoming hydroschizophrenia is the first major element in the paradigm shift in governance reform. The second, which I am constantly urging, is the need to introduce transdisciplinarity. See, you take any water resource department, irrigation department, drinking water department across India, whether nationally or in the states. Who are the human resources you will find there? You will find civil engineers, you will find few irrigation engineers, you mainly find civil engineers. You will find hydrogeologists, but I challenge you to find any water resource department in India which has the disciplines which I have mentioned on this slide. Water management does not exist. Social mobilization, without which you cannot, have a participatory management of water. Agronomy, without which you are not going to understand how cropping patterns need to be tweaked. Soil science, river ecology, and ecological economics. These have to become a fundamental part of the governance of water in this country. We have to get professionals from these disciplines into our water management departments. And incidentally, all over the world, this is exactly the best practice that is taking place. Everywhere you have water departments being populated by professionals from a multiplicity of disciplines which are relevant for the effective management and governance of water. The third element I'm talking about in terms of governance reform is that water is too important to be left to the government alone. We have to build multi-stakeholder partnerships and multi-stakeholder platforms. In the report which Professor Mahendra Dev mentioned, which I submitted to the Government of India in 2016, we are speaking about the creation of a National Water Commission. And in that National Water Commission, all of these elements of governance reform are to be incorporated, including the fact that, the kinds of people who are listening to this lecture today, the researchers, the academics, the practitioners on the ground, they must become enduring stakeholders, enduring partners of the government, not to be brought in and shunted out at the whims and fancies of passing bureaucrats and politicians. That's what's been happening so far in water governance. When you want IIT Kanpur to do a study for you, you bring in those people. But then they are, at the whims and fancies, so to speak. They are not there as enduring partners. What we are arguing for are enduring multi-stakeholder partnerships where government works shoulder to shoulder with farmers, with people's representatives, with professionals to actually alter profoundly the management and governance of water. And finally, I'm just mentioning the National Water Framework Law. This is another legal reform that needs to happen because different state governments sometimes are pulling in different directions. The tendency is to argue for a centralization of water, to bring water from being a state subject in the Indian Constitution to the central list. I am totally against that proposal. We should not, in fact, we should not centralize water. We should deepen the decentralization of water. We need to, in fact, deepen the principle of subsidiarity so that people are much more actively involved in managing the water because they are the ones closest to where the problem is. And we must therefore build on the principle of subsidiarity and ensure that primary stakeholders are involved. The National Water Framework Law proposes a framework, a legal framework of principles and practices which all state governments would sign on to, which would emphasize the principle of subsidiarity in its multiple dimensions. We have drafted this studying the legislations in the best case scenarios that we have across the globe, and this is also pending before the Government of India for its consideration. Next slide. Tanmay? Yeah. So in conclusion, I'm just reiterating the propositions of this lecture. If farming continues to be as water intensive as it is in India today, there'll be no way for us to meet the drinking water and livelihood requirements of millions of our people. If farming methods pay no attention to the soil that sustains them, then food security and farmer livelihoods will be in ever greater danger. If we continue to focus on rice and wheat in the support provided to farmers, we will be completely unable to tackle the twin syndemic of malnutrition and diabetes. This is a term used by the Lancet Commission in a recent report. Next slide. And if we continue to mindlessly extract groundwater, we will destroy the resource itself, but also the rivers that both feed groundwater and are being fed by it. Endless construction of large dams could threaten the very integrity of India's monsoon cycle. This is a point I have not elaborated in the lecture so far. If anybody wants in the question and answer session, I'd be happy to explain how, if we continue the way we are going, the very integrity of India's monsoon cycle could be threatened. And if we continue to destroy our catchment areas, our rivers will be unable to survive and sustain us. If our river basins survive, we also will. Otherwise, like many great river valley civilizations of the past, we too will perish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mahesh Shah, for an excellent lecture. So we have now this, my colleague, young colleague, Dr. Digvijay Singh, as discussant for 10 minutes or so. Digvijay?
Yeah, can I share my
You have to
screen?
stop sharing screen and allow Digvijay to share.
Yeah, Tanmay, you stop sharing. Yeah. Click on the stop share. Tanmay. Yeah.
हाँ सर.
No. Tanmay, promote Dr. Digvijay as a presenter because otherwise he cannot present. Yeah? Just click on that, yeah, then promote.
Okay.
Click on his name, then say promote. Promote to present.
Then I need to right click on that.
Yeah, right click. That dot is coming in here.
So I've done that.
Yeah. Fine.
Okay, thank
now,
you.
Yeah,
Thank
now
you.
Dr. Digvijay.
Yeah, thank you.
Tanmay, you also can promote to me so that I can control somebody's.
Okay, so I hope you can see my screen now. Can you?
Yes, we
Yes, we can see.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. So before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Shah for this paper. Actually, I got a chance to read the paper, so I think his views are very timely and very important, especially when we are debating reforms in agriculture, in Indian agriculture. Right. So I think these views are very timely and quite important, quite critical at this juncture in the growth and development of Indian agriculture. So having said that, I would just start with a caveat that I don't have the kind of experience with these the ground level experience of these kind of things that Dr. Shah has. So my views are I would say more more conceptual, I would call them. But I think they are compatible with what Dr. Shah has discussed in his paper and his slides. So let me now begin with a few of my views and my observations and my interpretation of what he has said in this paper. So just the paper spends some time on green revolution. So I thought I should say something about the green revolution. Green revolution, in my view, and I think I share this view with Dr. Shah, that it was essentially a water revolution. Right? Water was and still is the most critical input in agriculture. And we all know all this. I'll just summarize, just go through it. The green revolution period saw a dramatic increase in area under irrigation, and irrigation expansion was, essentially driven by groundwater. And we know all of this, that the spread of HYV weeds was more or less, the spread of seeds more or less tracked the expansion of groundwater irrigation infrastructure. So it basically followed the increase in expansion of groundwater irrigation. And what did this lead to? It was basically targeted towards rice and wheat. It was supported by subsidies on inputs and procurement on food grains at assured prices. So markets were assured essentially for all this food grain. So what were the intended consequences of Green Revolution? It led to mechanization of Indian agriculture. It assured food security to the country. There is evidence that it led to increase in rural incomes, investment in assets, improvement in education, and it also had spillover effects in the rural economy. And we know this, that agricultural growth in general is poverty reducing. So these were, I guess, the intended consequences of Green Revolution, but there were some unintended consequences also, which Dr. Shah focuses on in his paper. So what did this result in as an unintended consequence? It resulted in exploitation of groundwater resource. And here I have a map from the Central Groundwater Board of India. And you can see all the critical regions highlighted in red. And these are all heavily exploited regions. And, it somewhat coincides with the rice wheat belts of India, right? So, there is some association there. But was this intentional? Was this depletion of groundwater intentional? We don't know, right? And was this the only way to achieve the intended consequences of Green Revolution? Again, we don't know. But the focus of this paper is where do we go from here? So given that this is the situation we have, what do we do now? So what is the situation now? So we are producing far more food than we possibly need, right? And we have the procurement policy in place, so the government is locked into buying grains from the market at the support prices. And on the other hand, we are providing subsidies for inputs, especially electricity, which is leading to suboptimal usage of groundwater that we know. And this is resulting in overflowing of buffer stocks and rotting food grains. This is all well known. But what does this situation resemble? This situation actually resembles a prisoner's dilemma, so to say. Because of the procurement policy and input subsidies, farmers stick to producing food grains. But because farmers are producing more food grains, government is now bound to procure more and more food grains. So it's like a cyclical thing, right? A bad equilibrium, so to say. And what is the outcome of all of this? The outcome is suboptimal use of inputs and exploitation of resources, and that Dr. Shah has already, explained in his slides. So, what are the solutions? The solutions, and these are some of my questions on the proposed solutions. I mean, I don't have answers to these questions, but these are things which came up, came in my mind while I was reading. So the idea is to shift from rice and wheat to less water-intensive crops. But the question is, would farmers switch to pulses, oilseeds, or even millets? We know that their yields are low and they are relatively high risk. They are prone to pest attacks. And the reason is that technological intervention in these crops is not as much as rice and wheat, right? They have basically been ignored. And even if farmers want to switch to these crops, they may not be able to switch to these crops, especially in regions which have specialized in growing rice and wheat now. Why is that? Because of fixed costs. So, these regions have been growing rice and wheat for, like decades now. And the assets that have been developed there are now specific to these crops. So even if now farmers want to switch to, crops like millets and oilseeds and pulses, what about the fixed costs, right? So the fixed costs may be too high. The infrastructure that has developed, the value chains that are developed in these regions may be specific to rice and wheat. So they may not be able to switch. Right? We don't know. So, so here is a proposition. It's a clinical sort of a proposition, more of a textbook sort of a proposition. As I said, I don't have ground level knowledge of these things, but can markets act as a water saving mechanism? So, for example, think of this: with higher incomes, demand for rice and wheat will not increase. Right? We know this. So what will increase then? So what will increase is the demand for high value crops, oils, fats, pulses, fruits and vegetables, and even millets for that matter, because now millets are considered to be a health food, right? So now here are the questions. Can changing composition of demand itself correct the crop composition and induce diversification? Can market itself correct the skewed cropping patterns? Can market determine price of water as an input in agriculture and other inputs correct its exploitation? So, and why am I asking these questions? Because conceptually, prices are signals, right? Price acts as a signal in the market. And what does price reflect? Price reflects the scarcity of a commodity. So if you are distorting those signals, you are essentially distorting the signal of scarcity. So now coming to what is my opinion, and it's a myopic opinion. I say that with a caveat. So, in my understanding, diversification is a part of the process of economic growth and is induced and governed by market forces itself. So distorting market forces to induce diversification seems, to me at least, counterintuitive to the whole idea of diversification. So my understanding is that any policy designed to conserve water or any other resource has to square with fundamental market forces, economic market forces. And water and soil conservation measures should make financial and economic sense to farmers for successful adoption. But before all of this, market incentives have to be right? So the markets have to be right. I believe that water conservation cannot go hand in hand with procurement policies and electricity subsidies, right? They have to go. And finally, my final take on this, we have seen what state-sponsored and controlled technology push supported by assured prices and input subsidies can do. We have seen what green revolution can achieve, right? Both intended and unintended consequences. But now we feel that, this is a feeling that everybody shares, I'm sure. But now green revolution policies are past their expiration date, right? So they have their role, their utility is now gone. So perhaps, the time has come to give markets a chance. So that's, sort of my take on Dr. Shah's paper. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Digvijay. Then how do we go? Dr. Shah, we want us to
Should I give it? Yeah, I think no, this was a very substantial presentation. So I think I just give a quick response and then we can go to the, because I'm sure the audience also would like to take a very different point of view that you put forward by Digvijay. So Digvijay, thank you so much for making your points in a very lucid manner. And I think you have actually represented a quintessential viewpoint in economic theory, economic history. I'm sure Professor Mahendra Dev is aware of all the debates around all these issues. So look, let me just say that, I'm sorry, I can't but smile a bit wistfully at your statement. The time has come to give markets a chance, because actually markets are already there. They have had a chance. The Green Revolution was a consequence of humongous market failure in Indian agriculture. Actually, this has happened across the world. It's not. I've actually written a paper which has been published recently in the India Forum. It's actually titled "Mere Paas Sarkar Hai." So you may like to have a look at it. It actually tries to counter the entire framework that you have put forward today about the fact that markets are the panacea. See, I am not actually ruling out the importance of markets at all. I think markets are extremely important. They play a very important role, especially in agriculture. But we have to recognize the nature of market failure that happens typically in agriculture. What is happening is that 85% of India's farmers are now small and marginal farmers. And when they come, in an individual basis to markets, what happens is they face a very difficult time. And we must remember that before the entire architecture of food security was set up in India, it was a situation of free market, and we could see the kind of food insecurity this country was suffering from. So the Green Revolution was not actually only a water revolution. It was a revolution in the architecture of agriculture in this country, including agriculture marketing, because the government stepped in, as it has, by the way, done all over the world, even today. I'm sure Professor Mahendra Dev will give you all the literature on the huge subsidies that are given by Europe and America to their farmers to allow farming to survive. It's not the market which sustains farming anywhere in the world by itself. See, we should give up the fundamentalism of state versus market. I think we have to understand the complementarity of state and markets. And what I am arguing for, therefore, is also for state reform, because there is also government failure. Just like I'm saying there's market failure, there is government failure. And we need to understand that the policies of the Green Revolution, I agree with you completely, are now past their use by date. They need to be completely changed. And therefore, when you ask your question, will farmers shift? The point is, that is what I'm trying to answer, that farmers will only shift when they are incentivized to shift, when the market exists for them to shift. And the market can initially, I agree with you, that consumers can drive this change, but we know that that's a much slower process. And that process has to be kick-started by the government intervention that we are talking about, where we diversify the procurement basket, we introduce other crops to incentivize farmers to grow those crops. And as you said, the urban consumer especially is becoming more and more, conscious of nutrition, etc. That will also happen. When you say that there is greater risk in those nutri-cereals, pulses, and seeds, actually, I'm sorry to say, all literature on the subject, and the paper actually summarizes that the greater risk lies in monoculture of wheat and rice, which has been established time and time again. We can see that today. Why are the productivity levels of wheat and rice now plateauing and even falling in different parts of the country? Because you cannot sustain this kind of monoculture year on, year after. Growing the same crop on the same plot of land over and over again is actually a complete disaster. The fundamental characteristic of nature is diversity. You are dealing with nature. You cannot deal with it except in the language of diversity. And that's the kind of argument our paper makes. I completely agree with you that infrastructure requirements are there. And you are right that the infrastructure that exists on the ground is totally tailor-made to an older agriculture. But just like the Green Revolution, I mean, we need a very fundamental change where if you do not make, just think of the returns of investment. The returns on the investment that are made in infrastructure for supporting the new agriculture are huge. They are in terms of health, they are in terms of nutrition, they are in terms of water security. And, unfortunately, as I have been in the presentation also mentioned, ecological economics, we don't sufficiently recognize the value of the ecosystem services that are provided by these different elements of environmental regeneration and the contribution they make to GDP. And unless we recognize this more clearly, as economists, we will keep repeating the same mistakes that have brought us to this pass. I must mention in the end that I didn't include it in the presentation, but the paper ends with a mention of COVID-19. And what is the lesson that we must draw from the pandemic? I think it's giving you a very strong message that if you do not change your relationship with nature, with natural ecosystems, you are going to, in fact, inflict more and more misery upon yourselves, on the planet, and survival itself may be at stake. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are open for any questions. I can see Dr. Barbara Harris. Have any? Otherwise, first, Dr. Abhay Pete, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for a lucid and brilliant presentation, Dr. Shah. I'm particularly happy about the centrality of incentives. Now, by extension, I have nothing to controvert about what you said, but by extension, the underlying institutions like the Water Users Association need strengthening. Now, this will avoid elite capture and bring in some equity. But for farmers to have incentive to join WUA, they need to have a stake in the agricultural value chain. Would you like to comment on this? And the second thing is just a remark on what Digvijay was saying. I am more sympathetic to markets, taking in everything you said. But I think in the national water policy, after the minimum level of water benchmark level is taken care of and first protection, single protection is done, then there is a scope for water markets to emerge, I think. But anyway, my question is not that. I would like some comments on the agricultural value chain. Thank you.
Yeah. Should we collect some questions, Dr. Shah?
Yeah, maybe you should collect.
Yeah.
Yes,
Rupa and Pal, my colleague.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation and the subsequent comments. I just would like to make a very brief observation on the role of markets in this case. This is simply because of the externalities that is being created by farming activities, which is the excess exploitation of resources. So this is an externality which is being generated, which an individual farmer is less likely to take into account in a short-term basis. So that naturally calls for intervention by the state. So if we leave things on market as such, then these such externalities will never be corrected. Market does not take into account correct the externalities, and state intervention is absolutely necessary. So that's my response to Digvijay's comment on let's give market a fresh chance. So I think market alone cannot correct the water crisis or that we are at this moment. So economics does not actually talk about leaving things open completely to market when there are severe externalities in particular. Second thing, that my observation with respect to this groundwater overexploitation, of course, the incentives or the intervention schemes that have been designed at the time of Green Revolution and have been modified over time to some extent, but not very drastically. And now that we realize that we are almost at a crisis point as far as the water is concerned, of course, we need to redesign the incentive schemes for giving the correct incentives to farmers. So in this respect, I would also like to ask Professor Shah about his comments on the interstate water conflicts, which are also part of this entire problem of water crisis. It is not only the exploitation, but also some over-exploitation by some states, whereas less exploitation by some others, or say deprivation by others. That also creates a lot of problems. Groundwater scarcity is a problem, and created floods is another problem. So both excess and the oversupply when it is not needed. So how do you what would be the solution to that if we do not have
sure.
centrally planned policy which takes care of the the political problems or the political conflicts that is there.
Yeah. Any other questions? Somebody in the chat,
I think Barbara
would like to hear about
Barbara,
how.
I think.
Barbara, I think, has left. Yeah, would be somebody's right. We would like to hear about how monsoons would be impacted, as Dr. Shah mentioned that would explain in the Q&A.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So should I just take all these questions and then we go to the next one? Yeah. So the first one is about the value chains, and yes, absolutely. I think farmers need to move up the value chain. That's exactly the problem right now. And that is happening also because farmers are not organized. So the entire thrust towards farmer producer organizations, towards aggregation of commodities and marketing them together, and also actually moving farmers up the value chain, because once you collectivize and corporatize, you will have the capacity to move up the value chain. And a lot of good work is happening in that direction. And I think that needs to be even more strongly supported by the government through investments in that direction, which are careful to support this new paradigm of agriculture, which I'm trying to emphasize, which has a crucial building block on sustainability. The other point was about interstate water conflict, and that is why I was mentioning the National Water Framework Law. Now let's take the Kaveri dispute itself. In fact, I was asked to make a presentation in Chennai and trying to take that process of resolution forward. And I studied the Kaveri Basin in some detail. And if you examine the farm practices, whether in Karnataka or in Tamil Nadu, the fact is you are practicing the same kind of destructive agriculture. So water can never be enough. Let's put it very simply. The water that is available can never be enough if you continue with the kind of water-intensive agriculture that we have been engaging in. Actually, both Karnataka and Tamil Nadu has to reconsider the water paradigm and the farm paradigm. And once you do that, a solution to the Kaveri water conflict is at hand. So in order to facilitate this kind of, possibility, that is why we had drafted what we are calling the National Water Framework Law. See, what you need is not a strong center, because what that does is to centralize. I mean, we would be moving in the opposite direction to which we need to move. We need to actually encourage and support more decentralized management of water, but we need a framework of agreement. So it's a framework law. A framework law does not mean that the management and governance of water is centralized, but there is a common agreement across states on the principles and practices that will govern the management of water. Once you arrive at that agreement, then there is a possibility created of these viable solutions taking off on the ground. Of course, they have to be supported by everything else that we have said in our paper, because unless the economic incentive change, unless the procurement policies change, unless the subsidies, I did not mention this, but if you want to support agroecology, if you continue to give 80,000 crores in fertilizer, chemical fertilizer subsidy, what is there, where is the organic input going to come from? We need a huge amount of organic, inputs that we need to support agroecological agriculture in our country. And for that, again, of course, the farmer producer organizations, of course, the collectives of self-help groups of women can play a big role, but the state has to give some initial support. It will take off on its own. But right now, the fertilizer subsidy, as you all know better than I do, is hardly going to the farmers. It's actually supporting the industry. We have to break this stranglehold of vested interests created by the Green Revolution. Without doing that, without changing, therefore, the political economy of agriculture through a dramatic change in agriculture policy, and it can only happen with the kind of pressure we are seeing from the ground. Today, the farm agitation may be focused on a certain limited set of issues, but the fact that the farmers are on the streets reflects a deep crisis of farming in India. Any votary of the Green Revolution, there are many still who continue to say, no, we have to continue, we have to, increase the chemical inputs. They need to answer the question, why has the farming in India come to this pass? And therefore, that grassroots movement, I think, will drive over time the change in policy. I'll now touch upon the proposition I made that actually the endless construction of large dams can endanger in the very integrity of India's monsoon cycle. Now, here what I'm referring to is this famous or infamous, in my words, proposal for the interlinking of India's rivers. There's a proposal, there's a notion that some parts of India are surplus in water and some parts are short in water. So take water from the northeast of India and take it to the drylands of Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat and Chhattisgarh, and everyone will live happily ever after. Firstly, the fundamental assumptions are wrong. If you go to Cherrapunji, which used to be the rainiest place on earth, still is one of the rainiest places. Now, my organization, Samaj Pragati Sahyog, where I'm sitting right now talking to you, has been working in the drylands of Madhya Pradesh for the last 30 years and all over central India. And we train people from, these regions which are water scarce. You would be shocked to know that the latest training that we are doing is for people from Cherrapunji. In the Indian space, which is supposed to be water surplus, they are facing a major problem of water scarcity. So the foundational assumptions of this proposal to transfer, interbasin transfer of water over these large scales, the humongous costs involved, let's not even go into that. Let me explained to you what is basic hydrology. There is a Indian Ocean Monsoon Project run by the Ministry of Earth Sciences. There was a collaboration between Indian and American universities, and they have come up with this very startling report, which actually helps us understand what triggers India's monsoon cycle. The crucial thing that triggers that cycle is the flow of fresh river water into the sea. What that does is that when the river, finally, like the engineers say, don't allow the rivers to flow wastefully into the sea. You may have all heard this. It's like an engineering axiom. But the fact is, it is only because river water actually flows into the sea that the monsoon cycle is triggered over the Indian subcontinent. What that fresh water does is to create a low salinity layer in the upper reaches of the Indian Ocean. And that triggers the high temperature and low pressure areas that are created over the ocean, which finally triggers the monsoon cycle. Now, if you are going to dam all the rivers and have this great interlinking of rivers happening, you will prevent the fresh water of rivers from actually reaching the sea, and that will impair the triggering of India's monsoon cycle. This is latest scientific research, mind you. I can share all the literature. It's mentioned in our paper also. If anybody wants, I can give you more detail on this. But this is something which we need to understand. As our understanding of ecology has grown, of climate science has grown, we are starting to appreciate what nature is doing. And we have to learn to understand, to work within the parameters that nature has set for life on this earth. Otherwise, you have COVID-19 already, you could have the destruction of India's monsoon cycle as well.
Any more questions?
Sir, so I have a few points to make.
Yeah, please.
I briefly read your paper also, and you suggest that replacing wheat and rice by pulses and millets would not only address depleting water resources, but would also lead to nutritional security and would provide income security to the farmers also. But I want to point out a few issues. I feel that the whole issue boils down to procurement. I come from a farming background, and as far as I know, I feel that if the government ensures procurement of pulses and oilseeds, then nothing stops the farmers to diversify. And secondly, since the yields of pulses and millets are lesser than that of wheat and rice, the total PDS stock will reduce, and I feel that would endanger food security, since we know that the current stock was just enough to see us through the crisis. And thirdly, you talk about increase in diabetes. Is that because of increase in rice consumption, or yeah?
Okay. Yeah, you can take another question and then I can.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody? I see Dr. Narasimha Reddy. Comments? Dr. Shah, you mentioned about the water and energy.
I noticed another hand, Ashwini.
Yeah. Yeah, this is Dr. Petes thing, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking about the water and energy. What should be done? Because the free electricity, you can't everything, and you can't go to marginal cost kind of thing. But on the other hand, everything free also leads to, there's no marginal cost for the farmer, wastage of electricity, wastage of water. So those things also we have to have some balanced approach.
Yes. No, I agree with you. Actually, let me just quickly respond to Japneet, I think it was, right, who asked that question. I think the very important questions you have asked. The first thing is that, as you said, procurement is the key. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, that's what our paper emphasizes, that government has to diversify its procurement basket and make it agroecological. I didn't mention one thing in my presentation, it's there in the paper. We should also make it much more decentralized. You know, what is the logic of carrying all this grain and centralizing it in FCI warehouses and then again bringing it back to different parts of the country? Just take Eastern India. If you were to procure rice there, in much larger quantity. See, that's what I'm trying to repeatedly say. I'm not against rice cultivation. I'm saying rice needs to be procured from regions from where rice is agroecologically suitable to grow. You should not continue to grow rice the way you are growing in Punjab and Haryana. It's a complete absurdity. If you continue to do that, whatever you may do about anything else, water will be over extracted, and actually agriculture in Punjab and Haryana will be destroyed. We went to the extent of doing summer paddy, many of you are aware, and that's the kind of absurdity that we went in our arrogance that, look, I can even grow paddy before the monsoon comes because I can have so much irrigation, so much groundwater. We have actually written a paper called the Punjab Water Syndrome. You should read that paper about how the entire water table in Punjab is getting destroyed, it's getting salinized, it's either going lower and lower, or quality of water is becoming such so bad that there is uranium in groundwater in Punjab, etc. So absolutely, we need to make procurement agroecologically decentralized, and once we do that, we would be able to arrive at the right balance. As I said in the presentation, we are not saying, you mentioned about the yields, I agree with you, the yields, there is a relative comparison, but we are not saying stop growing wheat and rice. We are talking of a greater balance. And let us also keep in mind that we cannot continue to grow rice and wheat the way we have been growing it so far. If we continue in that direction, yields are falling, productivity is falling, and farmer incomes are actually being jeopardized. So we are very carefully, if you read the paper, we are not making an extreme argument that you abolish rice and wheat, etc. We are saying balance the cropping pattern, balance the procurement aspect, and also therefore balance your nutrition. Diabetes is not just rice, it's also wheat. Actually, I am a diabetic of the last 20 years. Let me share with you, I have completely gone into a post green revolution diet. In fact, sometimes we say we should practice what we preach. Well, what we have written in the paper, I am a living example of having shifted to a much more nutri-cereal, what used to be called millet-based diet, more pulses, more traditional oil seeds. India, we forget, has a very wide variety of traditional oil seeds which were grown as recently as just before the Green Revolution. I think earlier when Digvijay was making his remarks, he said, we can't force farmers. Well, farmers were growing all these crops quite naturally. Before you shifted, everybody onto rice and wheat in regions where they are not suited. I'm not saying we stop growing rice and wheat. They must be grown in regions which are suitable for rice and wheat production. But regions like Eastern India, we must procure rice. We must actually make that rice available in Eastern India. Procure it from there, make it available there. You reduce costs. As Professor Mahendra Dey will tell you, as the former chair of the CACP, the largest proportion of our food subsidy is actually the cost of warehousing, the kind of cost of storage that we have to incur. And that is because of this irrational centralization of the procurement process. If we decentralize more, I think we will be able to reduce a large number of costs. We must do investments in R&D, absolutely true. The yields of these what we call calling replacement crops are increasing in recent years. They need to increase even further. There is great potential. We are nowhere near the global standards. We can reach there. But for that, we need to fundamentally rethink Indian agriculture on the lines that I have presented today.
Yeah, Dr. Somesh.
Professor Mirsha, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting talk. So my question is that do we need to relook at the subsidy regime in India, wherein we provide heavy subsidies to say rice, wheat and sugar, and go for, as what you had suggested, crop diversification, and in that process probably go for biofuel like ethanol production from rice, say wheat, bamboo, and so on. So, do we go for the alternative energy needs using agricultural resources, and in that process address the climate change also, and the reducing water levels? This is question one. And question two is, sir, what do you think that with the water levels going down, do we need development of satellite towns and cities, or there's another way to address these questions? Thank you.
Right. Is there anybody else? Otherwise, I can respond to this.
Any more?
Yes, sir, Mahendra.
Yeah, any more
Hello.
question? Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I have already, thanks for a great presentation. I have already mentioned my comments in the chat. The main thing is maybe it's not only the advisory things will yield any results. Like in Punjab in 2009, they set up a Punjab Preservation of Soil, Subsoil Water Act, which could save some water. For instance, the advisory things since 1986, since Jol Committee have advised too many things. For instance, as you suggested that to cut the area under rice, but did not happen anything on the ground. So maybe we need more policies to rather than just advisory things. This is my observation.
Right.
Thank you.
So, Somesh, look, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we need to change the structure of subsidies completely. What we are arguing for is to support a different kind of farming. And for that, the subsidy will have to move from chemical inputs to more organic inputs. And I'm not talking of an indefinite subsidy regime. Let me tell you, we are already working on this on the ground. Our self-help groups of women are already producing the kind of organic inputs you need for a different kind of agriculture. All we are saying is in the initial period, some support is required for the transition to be enabled for the farmers. You know, this is a big transition we are talking about. Like Sukhwinder ji is saying, it's just not a question of giving advisory. We are actually talking of fundamental change in policy, in the structure of incentives, and in that some state support is required. For example, let me give you some other examples where the structure of subsidy has to change. You know, Digvijay was mentioning about the infrastructure which is already on the ground, what he called the assets which already exist. And the fact is, you know, for pulses, for farming through agroecological methods, you need very, very high level of storage facilities. You know, the moisture content in pulses is a make or break, as Professor Mahendra Dev knows well. So we have to build that kind of infrastructure for developing an agriculture of the 21st century. We need cold chain development. A lot of investment is required initially by the government, then the private sector can also play a role. But without changing the direction of investments and subsidies, this is not going to happen. And in economic terms, the returns are immediate and tangible, because the kind of saving you make in water, in nutrition, in health outcomes, if we effectively cost all of that, we see that we are making a killing rather than any kind of excess expenditure. About the biofuel, I absolutely agree that to the extent that waste can be mobilized as fuel, that's a very good idea. But you know, at times biofuel some years ago had become a kind of mantra for another kind of monoculture. So the Jatropha cultivation was being promoted even under MG and REGA. By certain state governments had issued a kind of diktat. I remember the Chhattisgarh government at that one time had said everyone must now grow jatropha on their fields. And that kind of monoculture itself leading to biofuel, of course, which is a noble objective. But if you resort to that kind of monoculture, that can also create its own problems. And Sukhvinderji, I agree with you. It's not just giving big statements or telling farmers do this or do that. You have to enable, facilitate, incentivize. And that's what our paper is about. It's about the policy levers which have to be put in play so that farmers can actually respond to the structure of incentives we create. This is not to be a moral revolution. This has to be something which makes practical sense. It can later become even a question of morality, if you like, but you can't give lectures to people when the structure of incentives you've created is totally contrary to the lectures that you're giving. So I think we need to create, as an economist, we always, have to think in terms of the structures of incentives that exist currently and how they need to be changed in order to facilitate another kind of economic behavior.
Okay, there are no any more last one or two questions. Yeah. Okay, then yeah, we will close, and I once again thank Dr. Mihir Shah for this excellent and useful lecture. I'm sure that people will read your papers, and also thank Digvijay for his comments, and thank all of you for participating in this important webinar. So thank you very much. We'll close the.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shah.